Review a 3D model. In this video, we'll review an outcomes 3D model and we'll modify a 3D model. In Fusion 360, we want to open two supplied datasets, additive bracket design.f3d and additive bracket mesh.f3d. These are the outcomes that were created from our additive bracket generative design study. So we're going to be taking a look at what's provided in these 3D models and some of the things that we can do to modify them. First, let's take a look at additive bracket mesh. Now, when you're creating a generative design study, you might be wondering why you would export a mesh over one of the 3D designs where you can continue to work with it as what's called a BREP, or the boundary or basic representation. So basically solid geometry that we can continue to manipulate. Well, in some cases, you might simply want to 3D print the design as is. And in that case, a mesh might work. Fusion 360 also has mesh manipulation tools and a recent inclusion of things like paramesh, where we can actually capture parametric data of how we can manipulate and modify these meshes. Meshes are not something that we're going to cover in this course, but I did want to make sure that we provided the additive bracket as a mesh so you could explore these options. We can do things like selecting our mesh and reducing or remeshing the entire design. For example, if we use remesh, we can preserve the sharp edges and boundaries. We can also preview the update. We can modify things like the density, and we can determine whether or not we want to preserve certain shape elements. We can also use these tools to focus on certain areas. For example, if we have a hole that we want to remove, we can use our selection tools, such as a freeform selection. We can select a certain area of interest, and then we can always go back and we can remove some of that geometry. Now, once again, we're not really going to spend time and focus on working with these meshes, but I do want to make sure that we at least understand and explore what the outcome looks like. So from here, if you want to continue to work with your mesh, make sure that you do pause the video and play around or get to it after we're done. But I'm going to save mine and I'm going to go ahead and close it and focus my attention on the additive bracket design. When we have an additive bracket design that's created from an outcome, we are presented with a timeline that has a handful of features. So let's begin by taking the timeline marker and rolling it back just after the first base feature. The first base feature that's created, if we expand the bodies, is our preserves. Any preserved geometry that was created in the generative study is directly brought into the design workspace. Next, the second base feature is going to include any obstacles. In our case, this includes the shelf and the wall. The next thing that we have is something called organic. Now, this freeform body is actually going to be a T-spline surface. And this T-spline surface is the integral part of this process because that's the geometry that we really want to look at and we really want to modify. So if we take a look at how this process actually unfolds, that organic or that T-spline body is actually a surface body. That surface body overlaps our preserved geometry and it's turned into a solid body by using what's called a boundary fill. That boundary fill doesn't matter really what this surface geometry looks like. All that it cares is that it touches or overlaps those solids. So this gives us a lot of freedom to play around with modifying that shape. And the last tool or feature that we see in the timeline is a combine. The combine actually takes all of the obstacles and subtracts them from the resulting solid body. So you can see areas where the organic body slightly overlapped those solids, and you can see how it's just cutting that away. Now, if we don't want to remove those, we can always roll back and we can keep that organic shape, and then we can go into our forms and modify. We're not going to be spending a lot of time modifying these freeform bodies because freeform tools take a lot of practice. You need to explore the tool set and you need to understand how to use it, but we want to focus on just a handful of tools that are going to be extremely helpful for us in this case. So in order to do that, let's right-click on Organic and select Edit. Once we select Edit, we're presented with all of the form tools. These are contextual tools that work on form bodies. We can also see sort of an opacity controlled version of the preserves, but we can't select these. And anywhere our form body has actually touched or overlapped that, you can see that they're blue. This means that they're frozen. This is something that the software does to make sure that we don't move that geometry. It wants to keep those in place. And if we zoom in, you can see there is a slight overlap, and that's how it controls whether or not this is able to turn into a solid body. But what if we want to modify this geometry? What if we're not happy with some elements of the design? Well, we have a whole host of modification tools at our disposal. If you've never worked with forms before, this is the point where you should really spend a lot of time getting familiar with form tools and understanding how they work, because these are going to be extremely helpful if you want to do any post-processing of your design. From here, there are a handful of tools that I do want to pick out and specify. The first of which is Edit Form. Edit Form is the manner in which we can move, rotate, or scale any of the vertices, edges, or faces. For example, as we're looking at this design, I'm going to change my selection to a freeform selection, and I'm going to use it to select some of the edges or areas around this opening. If I decided that I wanted to move that opening, I could just use the manipulator on the screen and move it around. But one thing you'll notice is that it's affecting geometry in ways that we probably don't intend. It's going to squish up against some of the elements and it's going to stretch some of the other ones. So as we're manipulating these designs, if we really want to keep some of that design intent, we can use a tool called soft modification. We can manipulate values, we can adjust the weight of influence, and we can really determine how this is going to affect the rest of the design. So if we were to increase this, let's maybe take it up to 0.75. What we're doing is we're extending the influence out. So everywhere that is highlighted as a red vertex is going to have the most drastic transformation. As it gets to pink, and then this lighter shade of pink ultimately to white, and eventually to no selected vertices, then we're going to see little or no influence. So if you want to make changes to some of the geometry, it's important that we understand things like the soft modification, as it's really going to be the only way that you can accurately move some of this geometry while keeping some of that original design intent. Some other aspects of creating generative models really end up being a very organic shape, and sometimes you want to smooth them out and give them more of a non-organic look or feel. So some of the tools that we can use for that, if we come to modify again, we can take a look at cylindrify and smooth. First, we're going to take a look at cylindrify. We need to select T-spline faces. In order to do this, I'm going to start by going to the front view, and then I'm going to drag my selection around here. And notice that what I actually ended up getting was a section that has an opening. This is obviously not a good option for cylindrify. So if we go back to the side and we select something that's just a sort of a single spoke, we're going to come over here and notice that now we're able to take it down to more of a cylindrical body rather than having it be that sort of pushed or squeezed organic feel. We can see the ghosted original body and we can see the result. So this is a great option to take some of these stems or spokes that are created and make them more cylindrical. Again, we can take a look at other tools like smooth. And in a lot of cases, you might find areas where you want to spend some time, like for example, right here, smoothing out some of these faces. One thing that we always want to be mindful of is making sure that we're selecting only a specific set of faces. You don't want to accidentally select faces that are not included in your area. So I'm going to manually select some of these faces by holding down the Control or the Command key, and I'm going to bring the face selection up a bit. Then I want to rotate this model around, and I want to grab the next set of faces underneath here. Now the reason I'm selecting this bottom edge is because this should give us a good idea as to what the smooth slider is going to do. We have a scale from 0 to 1. This is essentially going to be the amount of averaging or influence that happens. So as I drag this to the right, if I go to about half, you can see that it was a very minimal change. If I go all the way to 1, you can see that it's done a pretty good job of averaging everything out. This is not as drastic as you might have expected, but really what we want to do in the case of these generative designs is spend a little time just smoothing things out, maybe making some minor manipulations or changes. Now, if you want to do any drastic changes, for example, if you determine that you did not want this face to come up onto the back side. This is where having some time playing around with forms and understanding what they do really come in handy because this is a much more advanced technique. We need to use tools like modify, unfreeze, and we need to unfreeze faces that are attached to the design. And then we need to use modify edit form to manually move those faces. So I'm going to go ahead and select a few and I want to move them inward. And as long as I make sure that these are still overlapping our geometry and not creating like a bad pinch, then the boundary fill should still work fine. From here, I'm going to finish the form, which will convert this back to a surface body or a B-rep. And assuming that I did everything correctly, it should still turn it into a solid body. So you can see that face could move just a little bit more, but that's much better than having that bump on the backside. So as we look at this design, this is a pretty common result that we would get from generative design. It's going to have these sort of stems or spokes and some openings, and these are typical of what you would want to play around with and modify and smooth out. So I strongly urge you to play around with this model in the Forms toolset to make sure that you are comfortable with making these modifications and you explore what it can do on a generative design. This can be really helpful for post-processing your designs and getting them to that final position where you're ready to manufacture them. For this example, however, let's go ahead and save it before moving on.